Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's great to have you. It is November 8th. How many people are surprised by that fact? I am really surprised by this fact. But nonetheless, we are here today to do some good work. So I'm going to go through roll call. If you'll just say here as I go through, that would be fantastic. It'll save me from scrolling on the screen. So let's start with Dawn Alexander.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dawn. Yolanda.
Here.
Good morning, Kevin.
Here.
Thanks, Carlos.
Here.
Good to see you. Miss Ashley Chase.
She's joining at 8:30.
Okay, thank you. Jill Cohen.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Michelle.
Good morning.
Morning, Michelle. Jessica Daughter.
Good morning.
Hi. Tara. Let's see your Ida. Jennifer Isle. Leanna Gavin.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. And Zane, I know you're here because we just said hi.
Good morning.
Great. Nate Halpern. Adriana.
Hi.
Hi, good morning. Lori Jenkins. Shayna. Tess. Gina Lopez.
Good morning. I'm here.
Hi. Hi there. Kristen Menz. Michelle Murphy. Miss Margaret, I know you're here. Colleen O'Neill. Sarah.
Here.
Hi, Sarah. Rashan. I think we are down a few folks. Trace. Casey.
Good morning. Here.
Hi, and welcome. Nikki.
I'm here.
Great. Hi, Nikki. Kathy Wells. And Donna Wilson.
I'm here.
Hi, Donna. Let's see. Kelsey Works.
I'm here. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Jade.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Jade. Timothy Smelser. Okay. Is there anybody that I did not call task force member names?
Shayna Coran is here.
Oh, good. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. I think we are done with that. Moving along, turning to the approval of the October 4th meeting minutes. All of you should have received those in the Dropbox, as well as the meeting recap from the same date. Starting with the meeting minutes, which, by the way, were quite thick and extensive. I'm going to assume everybody had a chance to review those. So are there any edits or corrections that members would like to see to that document? Raise your hand. All right, I see no hands. Okay, then if I could have a motion to pass the minutes or approve the minutes of October 4th of 2023, as well as a second. And if you can announce your name as you make that motion, we can keep our record straight.
This is Gina. I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Gina.
Margaret seconds.
Thank you. Is there anybody opposed to the approval of the October 4th, 2023 meeting minutes? All right, seeing none, those meeting minutes will pass. Same process with the meeting recap. Again, this was contained in your meeting materials as well. Again, as a refresher, The idea behind this document is that it is a narrative versus the note-taking form of the minutes. And the substance of this will be, at least in part, transferred to our interim and or our full report. Having said that, are there any, again, edits to this document that members would like to see? All right, I see none. Again, same process. If we could have a motion as well as a second to approve this document, and say your name as you make the motion.
This is Kelsey. I'll make the first motion.
Thank
This
you.
is Shannon Fran, and I'll second that motion.
Fantastic. Are there any members who are opposed to the approval of the October 4th, 2023 meeting recap? I see none. All right, friends, that's my hard work today. Thank you for your help.
Thanks, Stephanie. Jordan, I'm going to bring it over to you if you're ready to hop in.
Absolutely. I'm just going to pull up the slide deck really quickly. Okay, can everyone see that okay? All right, hearing no objections, just coming forward. So good morning, everyone. Just want to come on and do a little bit of some administrative updates, as well as kind of preview where we're going to head in our conversation later today and what our upcoming meetings will look like. First up that I want to go through is, as Stephanie just mentioned, our interim report. You can believe it, we're actually coming up on that 1-year mark where we have to produce and submit an interim report, kind of capturing the work of the task force. This must be submitted by January 1st of 2024, which I can't believe we're almost there. So we're in the process of putting that together. As Stephanie mentioned, those recaps that we've been sending out to task force members following meetings will really form the foundation of what the interim report will look like. I don't want to give the impression it will be a direct copy and paste, but the way that we've captured discussions and presentations and kind of summarized information in those documents will be the foundation for how we move that into the interim report format. I anticipate that the report will largely be, just given the nature of the discussions of this task force, fairly chronological to kind of show the evolution of how we came to where we are heading into our 2nd year. As you all know, we've not made any conclusive findings and we've not made any conclusive recommendations. So none of those will be contained in the report. However, we are working to draft, and this meeting will be included, the draft of the report. Once we have drafted that interim report, we plan on distributing it to this group early to mid-December so that members can provide feedback if they find any, or connect us with kind of any amendments or corrections that they might see fit. So please keep a lookout in your inboxes in December. Again, we're not meeting in December so that we can have the space and time to produce that report. The CPO, per our enabling statute, is required to submit that report. So just as a reminder, it will go to both the House and Senate Human Service Committees, respectively, the Governor's Office and the Colorado Department of Human Services. Also, this agency will do similar to what we did with Timothy Montoya for those on that task force. We'll do kind of a media push so that citizens and other stakeholders are aware of the report as well. Any questions about what the interim report will look like, what the distribution or submission will look like? Great, and Trace, I can't see the full screen, so I just want to make sure there's no hands up I'm not seeing.
You're good.
Thank you. Okay, which kind of moves us into what I hope is the exciting part of our work today and for the next few months. As we talked last time, we are going to move into the discussion of assessing Colorado's definition of abuse and neglect. Based on discussions that this task force has had during its first year, through all of our member presentations, through outside presentations, and just member discussions, it became very apparent that this work is very crucial, not only for fulfilling our enabling statute, but for also carrying into kind of that pen to paper technical work that we're going to move into next year. When we met last time, we had suggested that we were going to break into subcommittees beginning the new year. One subcommittee would handle the definition, the other would start the discussion of warm lines. However, following that meeting and really assessing what members shared in that meeting, we kind of determined that it has to be a whole task force wide discussion. And also we can't really move into the warm line discussion until we decide theoretically what this group would like to amend or adjust in that definition in Colorado. So what we're going to be doing once we move and reconvene in January is focusing solely on that discussion for those 2 months. It will be that kind of foundational piece as we move into the warm line discussion and some other subcommittees that I'm going to go over in a second. I know that Brian submitted, he put together materials that we provided to you. Because of the short timeline you've had them, we certainly have no expectation that you've read them fully or have immersed yourself in them. Today will be kind of like that easing into that discussion, and also an opportunity for you to tell us what additional information we can pull as research and share with you when we come back in January. But just as some administrative functions, this is a big discussion, and we have a lot of work to do in a year. So I wanted to give everyone a roadmap of what it will look like moving forward as we have these discussions. Today will be kind of the starting off point. We're going to break into breakout groups, discuss broadly what members are going to need, what questions you have, what we as a CPO as a supporting entity can pull in research and give to members to really set up those conversations that are going to start in January in a very strong position. Like I said before, we do not have a December meeting. That will give us an opportunity, one, to get that interim report through, and two, to really get whatever additional research and resources that you're going to ask for today in place before January. However, as I said before, this is a really, really big discussion, and we can't spend the rest of the next year on it because it's foundational and we have 19 additional directives that we have to get through. So we've scheduled 2 additional meetings to what you got in your invites yesterday from those previously scheduled meetings. So we will have January 10th, January 24th, February 7th, February 28th. February 28th, we will be defining that definition for what this task force would like to propose. Again, we're not reaching for consensus, but we're going to largely move through, like, what are we going to put in our final report if we reach that point? That will be largely the end of that discussion. I do appreciate that these may conflict with other things on your calendar, so we're very open to sending proxies to these meetings as needed. We appreciate that might be a necessary, well, again, it's scheduling, so I appreciate what that is. So we're open to sending proxies for some of our members where that may be a little bit of a different role because you're not part of an agency. We're going to be reaching out to you individually to see if you're able to attend these meetings. What can we do to make sure that your voice or a substitute for your voice is present in these meetings? So we're going to work very hard to make sure we have representation of all of our members at all of these meetings. We just appreciate it might have to look a little bit different because of the scheduling in front of us. And the reason we really want to wrap up that discussion in February and use that discussion as foundation for the rest of our information is because, like I said, we still have a lot of work to do. As you know, there's 19 directives that we have to get through before December of next year so we can do our final report. Those directives will largely be divided into 4 different subcommittees. Once we finish that definition discussion, we'll move into the subcommittee discussions and we'll kind of piece through there and people can kind of self-select and we can review some of that. Jill, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, just for the new meetings, can you clarify what time they'll be?
Yeah, so those will all be 8 to 11 for the new meetings.
Yeah, and Jordan, if I can jump in real quick. So you received a lot of invites yesterday. You'll receive these additional ones today. We didn't want to put 2 January on your calendar and 2 February without giving you a heads up. So you'll get 2 more invites today, and that's those additional January, February. Sorry,
And then
Jordan.
also Wednesdays. Thanks, Trace, for reminding me of that. So again, like, just want to kind of preview the directives. We will be moving into them. We appreciate that this work on the definition is pretty crucial for us to have that conversation. Again, we just kind of always like to put these are also in your materials, or they will be by the end of the meeting, so you can kind of see where we're at in our directives. I'm going to stop sharing really quickly just so we can kind of move through today. As I said, you received 3 fairly in-depth research packets that Brian Kelly from our office produced and we submitted to you. I appreciate you got them on Monday. So again, we don't expect that you fully immerse yourself in them, and that's okay. We're going to have that conversation later today. I'm not going to dive deeply into those packets because Brian's going to come on in a little bit and really walk through his methodology, why he pulled what he pulled, why we thought this would be a good starting place for the task force. But again, nothing in those has been held out, as something the CPO is endorsing. We just thought that this was a very effective starting place for these conversations. based on the work of the task force in previous meetings. So what you do have in your packet is the 50 state comparison that Brian pulled from the Gateway, which really shows the definitions from each state. Brian will walk through what he prepared in his memo, kind of looking at different states that have amended their statutes or that have specific exceptions in their statute, in their definitions for abuse and neglect, excuse me. And then what we've also done, kind of in response to some feedback from some members, Jade, I'm looking at you, is also the consideration of the standard for reporting. We're aware that there are conversations going nationally that we want to incorporate here in Colorado, which is really, and Jessica Dotto, you mentioned this in your presentation a little bit last time, but is how do we value and potentially define that notion of reasonable cause to suspect or know versus cause to suspect? How is Colorado defining that? And what is the actual criteria there for that mechanism that induces that responsibility to report? So it became very clear that we're going to have to discuss these things hand in hand as we consider the definition. And Brian did a great job just pulling, again, a very simple baseline of where we can start in that conversation. I'm not going to go too deep into that because he's really the expert. But that's where we're going to start today. If I could just put in a tiny plug, we really want to give you what you need as a task force. So when you break into your breakout rooms and you're finding, I also need this, we really need to consider this provision, or I really want to look at this state very closely, please let us know. We're here to support in that role. We want to get you that material. We've taken it as far as we thought we could without really knowing specifically what you would like, but please utilize us as that resource in this space, because that's how we want to help you. And Trace, I think I've talked a lot. I apologize. I will hand it back to you unless there are any questions.
No, not talking a lot, but are there questions?
I do have a question, but I'm not sure if it's going to take us off track. So I'll ask it and feel free to tell me to ask it later.
We'll let you know, Jade.
Thank you, Trace. One of the interim committee bills, the Child Welfare System Tools, adds an entire new definition to the Colorado Children's Code around domestic violence. I know that we're just early, these bills aren't introduced yet, but I'm a touch nervous, a lot nervous about what's in there, especially while as a task force, we're looking at definitions as a whole. So I'm really just curious if there's, space for us to be talking about what is proposed in there as well, in addition to any other advocacy we might be doing. And I can put the link in the chat for folks that aren't familiar with what I'm referring to.
No, Jade, I appreciate you raising that. And I know many people on this call are still kind of recovering from the interim committee whirlwind, which was the summer in the past few months. You're right, it is in there. It's not introduced yet. I think that's something we will definitely share in the packets and can consider as a group. So let me include that in our materials next, Jade. I don't know quite what that conversation will look like, but let me at least provide that as a resource.
Wonderful, thanks, Jordan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, Jay, that's a good just tension point to note of, like, as things are ongoing, right? We know that the challenges and the conversations are not stagnant that we're working with. So how do we continue to weave those in? So appreciate that call out. Any other questions for Jordan around how we're thinking about this? Ashley, I think you joined kind of in the middle, but you're about to get a couple more invites for January, February. So that's kind of what we were talking about. We're going to have 4 conversations. So you'll see that in the slides. I just wanted to make sure you had that context. Any other questions from folks? Cool. So before we get into then kind of how we're going to break up this conversation today, and Brian, I'm going to bring you in just a minute. I did want to name, because we didn't name this at the very beginning, that we do have a new member. So Casey, it's virtual spaces are hard, but we want to make sure that folks know you're here and who you are. So if you could give a quick, Casey's replacing Brenya on the task force, and just wanted to give a quick shout out there. So Casey, could you do a quick intro just so as we go into breakout rooms, people are like, oh, I know who you are now.
Sure. Thanks so much. I have big shoes to fill from Brenya, right? But my name is Casey Hedrick. I'm the executive director for the Boys and Girls Clubs in Colorado. Been with Boys and Girls Clubs for nearly 15 years now, and just about every role that you can have. But, in focus of out of school opportunities and services to young people. So now in this position, get to focus on the strategy and the advocacy as it relates to Boys and Girls Clubs and supporting clubs across the state in that out of school realm. excited to be here, and thanks so much for letting me be a part of this important work.
Cool, Casey. Thanks so much for being here. We really value Boys and Girls Club being at the table, so appreciate you stepping in. All right, so as Jordan said, we're going to spend a lot of time in 2 breakout groups today. So ideally we would be in smaller groups, but we're going to facilitate a little bit more strongly through those. And we want you to sit with this information that Brian put together because we know you haven't had a chance. And then we also want you to dive into some kind of key questions around what's standing out, what's missing, what questions do you have, et cetera, so that we really can leave the meeting today and set ourselves up again, like Jordan said, kind of hit the ground running in January. So that's really the purpose of today. It's going to feel a lot like a lot of information, and it is, but really we want to make sure that in January, you're not like, wait a minute, I don't have what I need in order to fully participate in this discussion. So that's really what today is all about. So Doris will be in one group, I'll be in the other. We'll break out, we'll see how much time we have left. You'll be working kind of with this information that Brian's about to talk about, and then we'll all kind of come back together to just kind of hear a little bit about what each group really kind of jived around and where there was momentum and where there were big questions and whatnot. Then we'll do public comment. It's a 2-hour meeting today, and then we'll be done. So with that said, Brian, our research hero, if you wouldn't mind jumping in, and would love to hear kind of, again, these are the things that you received via email. If you didn't get that email for some reason, shoot me a quick note in the chat and I'll forward it to you real quick. But that's, if you bring that email up, those are the resources Brian's going to be talking through.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'll talk to Stephanie about formally changing my title to research hero away from public policy analyst, but we'll see where that goes. Yeah, I'm Brian Kelly, relatively new here. Started about 4 or 5 weeks ago, so I haven't been able to meet you all yet, but really happy to be part of this task force and hopefully help you in your really important discussions that you're having. So I just wanted to give a really quick overview of sort of why I'm talking right now and why we're sharing these things with you. And then I'll just very briefly go over how I went about my methodology of pulling out the resources that I did, and then just briefly walking through them so you have a chance to put eyes on them. But so the general question of why are we sharing these, Jordan already mentioned this, but just want to make it very clear that these policies that we're talking about in other states, these aren't endorsements from the CPO. This is just ways for us to understand what's happening in other states, sink our teeth into what this looks like in practice in statute and regs elsewhere, and then take out nuggets that might apply in our considerations of what would work best in Colorado. That could be either positive things like, oh, I really like what state X did around this area, so maybe we can dig deeper into that, or maybe think about applying that in our own discussions about Colorado. The opposite is also just as helpful, saying, oh, I really don't like the approach that was taken in these states. Let's steer away from that. I think that's still a value add to the conversation. So just to make clear that these aren't endorsements from the CPO. We're not beholden to adopt or implement or adjust anything that we talk about when we're looking at other states, but this is just an opportunity for us to learn what we like or don't like, and what might be feasible or not feasible when we're thinking about what things will look like in Colorado. And then just one last thing, we're also, I had the sad news to tell you that there's no state that doesn't have a problem with child abuse and neglect. No state has a magical silver bullet in statute that radically makes everything better. So just to set expectations that when we're looking at other states, maybe possibly in the future we'll have speakers from other states, that we're not holding it up as an endorsement. We're also not, don't have the expectation that making that one little copy paste into statute in Colorado will make everything fine. But these can all be components that lead to a better future for Colorado and the systems that we're seeking to improve with this task force. So now that I've given that little plug, I'm just going to share my screen and talk a bit more specifically about what we have shared with you all. So let me make sure. Okay, y'all see that PDF there? Okay, so as Jordan mentioned, the Child Welfare Information Gateway, which is a federal, it's maintained by U.S. Department of HHS and their Children's Bureau. They have a really good information capture of what policies exist in other states. It's a bit unwieldy how it's presented on their website. So that's why we sent this scary looking 113-page PDF. But don't worry, we're not expecting you to read through all of this or absorb all of this. That's largely what I've done in the smaller briefs that I sent you. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the whole like treasure trove of information that's available out there from this resource that you have and you can look through if you want to. But so what Child Welfare Information Gateway does is they've collected all this information specific to definitions of child abuse and neglect. You can see that big header here. They also have many other similar resources for many other components of child welfare policy in states. So they're a really good resource to look at. Within the definitions of child abuse and neglect, they have for every state broken down what the statute says about these different categories. So I'll just very quickly read through these. So components about definitions of child abuse and neglect that address physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, exploitation, emotional abuse, abandonment, standards for reporting, persons responsible for the child, and exceptions. So as they found it, you have each of those pieces of the puzzle for each state and some territories in this resource here. And so what I've done is I have compiled and gone through and analyzed the standards for reporting sections for each of these states, and then distilled that into the 4 or 5 pager that we sent, and then also this exceptions piece, which I think is just will be of interest to the task force. So I'll go into this first document that is, again, this distilled version. This is looking at exceptions to definitions of abuse and neglect. So what that means is within the definition of abuse and neglect in statute, there are some states, I think the total is 13, that make some sort of an exclusion requirement or special consideration for either certain characteristics or certain populations within the state to say that a report of child abuse and neglect can't only be confirmed or substantiated because the person is part of a certain category. So for instance, the largest trend that I found within this is there are 10 states or 9 states in DC that say it's not sufficient to claim neglect is existing solely because of the socioeconomic status of the case under consideration. So I can show you an example of what this looks like. This first page has this chart that breaks down the summary of trends, and then alphabetically listed under it, there is the actual language being used in each of these states, along with the link to the citation, so you can look and see the full context of what all is included there. But so for this largest trend, not neglective tied to socioeconomic status, we can look at Arkansas right here. Arkansas, it is not considered neglect when the failure to provide appropriate care is caused primarily by the financial ability of the person legally responsible. So there are 10 states that have something similar to that. And also, as you'll see, some of these states qualify for multiple of these categories. And I'll just quickly walk through the remainder of these trends that we found. There are 4 states where unaccompanied or homeless status is not sufficient for the report of abuse. So it can be considered, but in and of itself, homelessness or an unhoused status does not qualify or does not cross the threshold into child abuse and neglect. 3 states, including Colorado, have a caveat that you must consider cultural differences when making an analysis in a decision on child abuse and neglect reports. 2 states say it is not neglect if services are unavailable or have not been offered. So again, we look at Arkansas for an example of that. Not considered neglect, ... when no services for relief have been offered. There are 2 states that have components like that. And then finally, in California and Washington state, that disability status is not sufficient for a report of abuse. I can quickly show you. So in California, there are a few provisions going on, but the physical or mental incapacity or both in itself of a parent or a child shall not result in a presumption of need for child welfare services. So without getting into too much more detail about this resource, these are just, as we're considering what Colorado may or may not want to adopt into its own considerations of abuse and neglect, these can be examples that we can dig deeper into. If you're interested, a service we can provide is having somebody from one of these states come speak about what that has looked like in their states, and you can pick their brains more further than you could pick mine on this topic. But yeah, I'll briefly just Trace, I see you unmuting.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to pause after this resource and just make sure we didn't have any questions. And then just looking at time, let's move on to the next one. Any questions regarding this particular scan here? Again, you'll have time with this in the breakout room, and we'll talk a little bit further around how we're thinking about this, but just want to make sure. Cool. All right, Brian, we got it. This is amazing from Crystal. So keep it going.
Okay, we'll cruise on into this one. So this is the standards for reporting abuse and neglect, which again is one of those categories that you saw captured in each state in the gateway resource. So this looks at how states throughout the country vary in the standards that they set for when reports of child abuse and neglect are mandatory. Just as a very quickly going into the summary of trends here, the largest trend that we found throughout the states is that 34, so this is a combination of states and some territories and DC. So if you're not entirely sure what AS is, that's fair. American Samoa and some other territories are included here. But there are 34 jurisdictions that include that a report is required when there's reasonable cause to know, suspect, or believe. There are 12 jurisdictions that phrase it a little bit differently, saying when one has reason to know, suspect, or believe. There are nine jurisdictions that also, in addition to a different standard, they also include this provision saying that if somebody has witnessed youth being subjected to conditions or circumstances that would lead one to believe, then that is also a component of their statute. 4 states have this requirement for if one reasonably knows, suspects, or believes. 2 states say for one who has cause to suspect or believe, and then 5 states just didn't neatly fit into one of these buckets. I'm going to quickly just scroll down to the bottom to show you the second section of this. But as you can see, this is just alphabetically saying more specifically what the state itself says and giving a link to the statute. So you can take a deeper look at where that sits. Then this is just a second way of presenting the information from that initial chart. There were many different types of phrasings that were used. I made those larger buckets from that graphic on the first page, like reasonable cause to know, suspect, or believe. This just shows you what the exact phrase is used that's common between these different components that was then absorbed into the larger bucket. So there are these different ways of talking about reasonable cause to know, suspect, or believe. So that's true for each of the different categories that I selected. And then these miscellaneous other categories that are just a bit different and didn't fit into one of those. So like Alabama says if one knows or suspects, which is just quite different than talking about the reasonable cause. So as you can see, I haven't included any information about how courts interpret these, what these look like with boots on the ground conditions. There's quite a lot in the literature about these different standards for reporting, about possible subjectivity involved in these phrases being used, possibly recommendations for definitions to be built in, specifically giving more guidance on what reasonable cause to suspect means. For instance, I'll just point this out really quickly. California embeds in statute, when they talk about the requirement that you know or reasonably suspect, they then define reasonable suspicion, and they talk about what reasonable suspicion does or does not include. But that's a lot for us to sink our teeth into. And yeah, we're happy to entertain any questions. And like Jordan said, our job, and my job for sure, is to give you all things that are useful to you. So if there's anything else you can think of that would be helpful when we're having these conversations, please let us know, and I can work on turning that around for the task force. And then also that works the other way. If you think that this actually didn't really add to the conversation, just please let us know so we can just work at providing you things that help in your considerations. But Trace, I'll pass it over to you, and if there are any Q&As before we go to breakouts.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. Seeing some love in the chat and a couple of notes. Just make sure you get a chance to read through those, if you will. All right, y'all. Thank you for sitting and listening to that. a lot to get through. Again, you're going to continue to have these resources as you go on. We're just building on them. And so we want to get a chance today, kind of as a level setting, like we keep saying, how is this landing? What else do you need? So there's going to be two note catchers, or well, sorry, yeah, there's one note catcher for each group when you go in. They're going to be asking kind of these key questions that we're really trying to tease out. So we've got 45 minutes, I think, to go into breakout rooms. Doris, does that sound good to you? Okay, we'll do 45 minutes in breakout rooms. Then we'll bring folks back together. We'll have a couple folks share out, just because I do think it'll be helpful to hear each other's kind of thinking around what else you would need or what really stood out, etc. And then we'll do public comment and we'll close. Any questions before we do that? Stephanie, any comments or anything that we need to share? Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so two groups. I am going to break us out now, and we will see you back in 45 minutes. All right, welcome back. We've got, can everybody hear me okay? My computer's being
We can hear you.
You can hear me?
We could hear you before.
Okay, sorry, my screen was frozen, so I didn't know if folks could hear me. Doris, my internet's kind of going in and out. Wondering if you want to jump in and let's do some kind of. We had I think a great conversation and a lot of like just generating of thoughts and questions in our group and in the note catcher, but also kind of out loud. So would love to hear from your group. Anybody you want to pick on in particular to kind of share out, and then we can pass it back to my group.
Awesome. I am happy to pick on somebody. So we also had I think like robust engagement with the note catcher and also some conversation out loud. I'd love to pick on, if you will, Margaret, to just kind of share any of the highlights that you heard and saw in the note catcher. I think particularly around some of the things that the group liked about what other states are doing, and then also some of the outstanding questions that the group had.
Sure. So some of the things that came up that we really liked were differentiating poverty and neglect, helping folks understand through some statutory guidance that poverty does not equal neglect, that homeless does not equal child abuse, that there are new lenses that we need to pay attention to there. We liked the overlay of understanding cultural differences and child rearing practices with respect to that connection with what's reasonable parental discipline, and having a definition there that folks could rely on. We noted some common gaps, didn't see immediately defined. I think it's just too subjective. Well, that's my opinion. But that's something that we noticed was a gap in other states' legislation as well. We liked focusing on the capacity of a caregiver. Does the parent have, for example, a disability that's preventing them from accessing services that we could support instead of reporting? And that brings us to the whole concept of supporting. Should we create an exception in situations where the reporter is offering community resources? And I should say, should we create an exception for charging a reporter for failure to report in a situation where they're offering community services or they're trying to rectify the situation that is before them, rather than rushing to a failure to report situation? Let's see. I would also welcome anybody in the group to jump in. And I think, Doris, you also asked about what questions we have.
Yeah,
So
for additional information, what additional information would our
be
group
helpful.
like to see? Yeah.
Yeah, so we did have a conversation about what states out there are seeing a strong percentage connection between reports and substantiated child abuse situations. What are they doing right? What does their law look like? And we talked about that with the overlay of differentiated response in Colorado and how that can have an impact on what that percentage looks like. We are interested in the states that are universal states versus the ones that name and label professions for reporting purposes. Does that seem to have any impact on the number of reports versus what's substantiated? We did name the fact that we would like domestic violence to be clarified in statute with respect to its connection with child abuse and neglect. And specifically, could we embed, or are there other states that have embedded a time frame for safety planning in those situations before a report is mandated? Let's see. Oh, gosh. Anybody else want to dive in? I'm looking through our comments. We had a lot of discussion and it was great.
Awesome. I appreciate you, Margaret. Just a couple of other themes. There was a theme around looking at any states that have made substantial changes to their mandatory reporting laws, what the impact of those changes has been, particularly looking at whether there was any improvement in disparities or disproportionality was specifically called out, and looking at any distinctions between states that are state administered versus county administered, and wanting to have an understanding of how any changes played out with those particular considerations, looking at what's really comparable apples to apples and what may not be as easily implementable in Colorado. So with that, I'll turn it over to your group, Trace. I know we're starting to get tight on time.
Yeah. I don't see any members of the public that have requested public comment. So just want to say it out loud too. If there's anybody that would like to provide public comment, let me know in the chat so that I can save enough time for you. Moving over to my group, I was just looking at who generated the most questions. And it was kind of a tie between Stephanie, Gina, and Ashley. So Gina, you came off video, which means maybe you're excited to share. But I'm getting the head nod. Okay, so Ashley, I'm gonna pick on you then, to just kind of share some, like, twofold. One, where you kind of landed on questions, thoughts, things that stood out to you, but also two, what you kind of heard in our group as well.
Sure. I think our group had some similar thoughts to what we've already heard from other groups. There was a lot of discussion about how this reasonable term is used in the vast majority of the states, and that it's very difficult to define and understand, particularly if you are not an attorney, who most mandatory reporters are not. And I think that Donna made some really good points in our group that what's reasonable to me might be different to somebody who comes from a different community and has a different background and different life experience. So, I know in looking at all these definitions, even though they might change slightly, reasonable versus reasonably versus whatever, they're remarkably similar. There's only like one or two or three that have anything different. So I don't know, maybe that's a good way to focus on things. Sorry, I'm trying to pull it back up so I could see the actual questions. I mean, that's really where we spent a lot of our time, Trace, was really talking about that neglect, that reasonableness and how difficult that is. But and it kind of resonates through, I think, everyone's comments and all three of the columns. There was also some information about, you know, knowing what the definition is one thing, but knowing what the accompanying criminal charges would be, or what they're looking at in order to actually say a mandatory reporter hasn't done what they're required to do under statute is the other piece, or the flip side of the coin, that we might need to look at too, that we hadn't yet, because that's sort of the other side of that equation, which I thought made a lot of sense.
Appreciate that, Ashley. Yeah, I really excited my group by coming in and asking the silly question of like, what's the definition of reasonable? And everyone's like, ah. And someone said, you have to go to law school for that. So that was a really good conversation starter. Brian, I see your hand up, and then Doris is how you come off mute. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I should have said this in my beginning intro, but I'm very excited to hear these questions about things like how do states define immediacy? If they do, how do states address issues like the reporting requirement only exists within capacities of your job. And just to let you know that I'm already working on a 50-state comparison resource similar to these, but a bit more in depth, that looks at a lot of those other components, that we can lay the foundation of this definition of child abuse and neglect, like Jordan was saying. And then once we have that in place, that'll help to inform also considerations of like warm line policies. We're in the process of preparing resources on how other states have approached those issues too. So again, if you have any suggestions or desires for information on certain areas, please let us know. Put it in that note catcher, or just you can contact me individually or any of us. And then we'll we want to help you and provide you with as much useful information as possible. So just have that in mind, that we're continuing to work on things for future work.
Brian, the quicker way to say that is help us help you. That's right. Stephanie, putting on your participant hat here, I appreciated some of the thoughts you had around what was swirling in your brain and stuff you were calling out. So I'm picking on you, which maybe I'll hear about later, but I'm picking on you now to share a little bit about the reflection. I think that'd be good for the group.
Yeah, I really reflected that. I think my constant my concern goes to like the 100,000-foot level, right? And it is this confluence between trying to administer social services to people, and at the same time, which is should be based. It should be relational. It should be voluntary, right? It requires being in relation with somebody to accept services, and overlaying that with a court system that is not designed to service people. It is designed to enforce things, right? And to me, this mandatory reporter laws, we were looking at it deeply today, goes back to this notion of, again, we want the community to be helpful in identifying abuse and neglect. And then we're going to overlay it with this really incredibly technical, complex, wonky definition that will take even a good lawyer hours to weed through if you really want to understand what it means. And even then, we don't have the answers. Like I can read these statutes forever, and we still don't have answers to some key questions. So I guess at the end of the day, I become a little bit overwhelmed with this exercise. And how do you make, when you're working in human services, how do you allow there to be a human service approach to it? Meaning, how do you make this accessible? If you're going to have mandated reporting, how is it accessible, right? How is it understood? How is it implemented in a way that is human versus I want you to weed through these definitions, and if you don't read them through correctly, you could be subject to prosecution. Like, it's just incongruent to me how we have laws that do not work within a human service system. That's my personal opinion. I'm not suggesting we never have laws. I love law. I'm a lawyer. But at the same time, I don't understand how these two things come together. And I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues here who can help me, because it's I think, very complicated.
A good clarifier. Like, I'm not suggesting we don't have laws. I'm a lawyer. I love laws. It's a quote. Put it on a shirt. what else? I'm kind of, Doris, I don't know if you want to jump in on anything, but just kind of curious as again, we've got a lot of work ahead of us between now and January to ensure that folks kind of have what they're looking for. And so really appreciate everyone diving in today. Certainly helpful on our end. But anyone else want to share just kind of general reflections, what's sitting with you where you're at? And Doris wanted to invite you into if you wanted to go a different direction.
No, I think that's good. But I see that Jade, well, I'll say one thing. One of the themes that kind of I think parallel the conversation that you had in your breakout around the definition of like reasonableness and how that plays out and what that actually means from state to state, because the standard may be different, was something that bubbled up in our group. So having a little bit more context around that, I think, would be really helpful. Or not, I think, from the group's perspective, would be really helpful. And then Jade, I see that you came off mute.
Thanks, Doris. Yeah, I was going to echo what you were saying a little bit, Stephanie. I think there's a question about our definitions. There's also a question around reporting requirements and then penalties for failure to report that I think are all super integrated here. And in some ways, we could make a lot of changes to definitions and leave reasonable cause to know or suspect how it is, and that would have some impacts. We could change reasonable cause to know or suspect and leave our definitions how they are, and that would have some impacts. Or we could do both. But I've just been reflecting on like how all of these things are interacting to put us in the situation we're in right now. It's much more complicated than just like put a caveat that poverty does not equal neglect and we're good. Like it's just so much more nuanced and complex than that on how all of these different pieces interact. And so I agree a bit in the overwhelm of kind of where is even the right place to start and how do we want to go about which piece we tackle, or if we tackle.
I like that you named that, Jade. One of the things that I think is really interesting and I think important about the work that this task force is undertaking and the charge that it was given is that the charge is very comprehensive. And so there is an opportunity to look at all of these components. And so, it's not just looking at the definition, but it's looking at, all these other, I think it's 19 charges of this task force, so that there is recognition that, just sort of like teetering around the edges on this one piece may not have the kind of overall impact that, to use one of Stephanie's terms, that really is bold reform. So I think that, that this group has an important opportunity to really look at all of those pieces, which taken as a whole is very overwhelming. But I think looking at them as component parts is intended to make it a little bit easier to take individual bites at the elephant. Crystal, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say, so I am a social worker and I am thinking about things in a relational manner. And I think the thought about how to empower mandated reporters to actually connect struggling families with some supportive services is, really key. In our breakout group, Jade mentioned that she had seen Arizona training materials for mandated reporters that not only told them how to recognize and report abuse, neglect, but also gave them some information about how to connect families with services at the community level, which I think is brilliant. And I haven't heard that anywhere else in training curriculums. So of course, there's a lot of discussions going on around, are there warm lines where a mandated reporter or a family themselves could say, I'm struggling, and have someone help them navigate to get community-based resources or concrete needs. So I forget whether or not that's actually part of the charge of the mandatory reporting task force, but I can tell you jurisdictions across the nation are looking at not just changing and trying to narrow that front door with mandated reporting, but also trying to link families to more prevention-based services at the community level.
Thank you for that, Kristen. Jill, real quick, and then I want to pass it back to Trace for some last minute items before we wrap it up.
Okay, I'll be brief. I just want to say I think it would be powerful to say something very specific, like having a disability or being poor is not a reason that you should call in the statute, because so many people that are mandated reporters are not us here who are ensconced in the child welfare arena, right? Like a vet, for example, a dentist. And the other thing is, I think that the reason to have a great statute is because that will help us create great training, and also will make it really clear what the penalties will be for us. And like that, the statute seems to me to be the one way where the district attorney would make their decision about whether or not the person should be pursued for not making a report. So that's where I'm thinking after today's discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, I love
Trace, handing it back to you.
I'm just thinking, I love the specificity that we're getting to here around folks just throwing something out there for people to respond to. So I'm looking forward to that when we kind of reconvene in January. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Again, thanks for diving in and doing the work. Much appreciated today. I want to pause us on that. Jessica, daughter, it sounds like wanted to come do a little circle back from your the last meeting on some things you wanted to follow up on. So you have the floor. So this is, again, not related to today's meeting, but to a previous meeting where Jessica presented. So we don't have any public comment, Jessica. So if you want to take us all the way up to just a few minutes left so we can wrap, we're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, I got some really great questions during the October presentation about kind of taking even a deeper dive into looking at the data that I provided regarding the failure to report charges in the last 10 years. And so I just wanted to follow up with, I reviewed as many as I could. I wanted to review all of them, but some of them just didn't have actual information that I could see because of the age of them. So I wanted to review all of them because there were questions about whether failure to report cases were done in or out of the capacity, whether the ones that were charged, who the reporters were, and what the underlying abuse concerns were. And so as a reminder, from 2010 to 2020, there were 70 cases in which a person was charged with failure to report. And out of those, 19 resulted in some sort of guilty plea. None of them resulted in jail. All of them were either probation, which were all successful. None of them were revoked or sent to jail. Or some of them were what we call deferred sentences, where it's a probation where the case can be dismissed at the end of the probationary term. So I reviewed the 19 that actually resulted in guilty dispositions because it was really difficult to see the other 50 to see actual information about those three questions of capacity, who the reporter was, and what the underlying abuse was. And I did find that 2 of the 19 cases were social workers. 1 was a professional counselor. 5 were school employees. And 8 were clergy members. A little caveat on that is that the clergy members, those 8, 4 of them had dual roles as school employees. 2 were peace officers, police officers. And then 5 were unknown. I just couldn't access that information. Yes, Crystal, this was over 2010 to 2020. How many people were charged with failure to report? 12 of the 19 cases were for a failure to report unlawful sexual behavior. 1 was for physical assault, and 1 was for injurious environment. And that extended out of somebody having possession of a weapon, a child having possession of a weapon. 5 I couldn't see, again, because I just couldn't access the actual police reports in an easy way.
Out of the 19 that resulted in those guilty pleas or verdicts, 10 were given cause to know or suspect abuse in their professional capacity as mandatory reporters, and 3 were given cause to know or suspect abuse in their personal capacity. 6, I could not see whether it was professional or personal capacity. I also tried to categorize the motives potentially for failure to report from the information I could gather, including the defendant's statements about why they did not report, or some kind of obvious incentives, or what at least I drew were inferences of like partiality or to me, obvious incentives. This is very subjective to me as a prosecutor, what I reviewed from the police report, so I put it with that caveat. 4 cases were obviously related to a colleague's behavior. They were people that worked in the same industry. I think those are mostly schools. 6 cases related to a family member's behavior. And those actually, some of those cross-interacted with schools that had colleagues that were family members that they did not report on. And then 2 appeared outright to misunderstand the law. They made statements to the effect of that they didn't think that it met the burden of or the standard for having to report. So I thought that was important to kind of put into some context in kind of responding to the concerns that the mandatory reporters have and that we all hear about with with the structure of the law, and then what and who are actually prosecuted and who's actually found guilty or asked to plead guilty in these cases. Finally, a few of those 19 cases, also important, had multiple co-defendants stemming from the same failure to report. So in reality, there weren't 19 incidents of failure to report from 2010 to 2020 that were determined to rise to the level of guilty pleas or guilty verdicts. It was less than that, because there were a few where, say, like 4 failure to report cases all stemmed from one incident. But they were four parties, 4 reporters who did not follow through with their duty. And then just kind of my final note on it is that hopefully this helps kind of guide us in improving, like I said, our directives as a task force, and improving the way that the law is written in training, in my very humble opinion. And of course, from my perspective as a sexual assault resource prosecutor, it speaks to the need for training regarding sexual abuse, considering that 12 of the failures to report were for unlawful sexual behavior. It was clear there was a fundamental misunderstanding of what child sexual abuse is, and a need for clarification on the mandatory reporter's duty to investigate, because it seemed clear in the cases, at least, that where they ended up pleading guilty, that they had, many of them had basically raised the bar to higher than suspicion on cases of sexual abuse, right? They needed more than just main suspicion. They needed more because of the fact that it was sexual abuse. They felt like they needed more. So just kind of, like I said, that's a bit subjective. It's taken from what I'm reading in the reports. But I also thought that the number of people who were related, the failures to report related to a family member's behavior or to a colleague's behavior, stresses the difficult conversations that need to be had with mandatory reporters in training regarding their duties taking priority over personal conflicts. So like I said, yeah, totally pretty separate from what we were talking about today, but I wanted to follow through with that so that you could have that context in terms of what happens in Colorado, and hopefully that can help propel our discussion with what are the important parts that we need to focus in on in making any recommendations for the change in the statutes.
We love a follow-up, Jessica, so don't apologize there, though I do have a bit of info whiplash. I'm wondering, I love it though.
Hopefully
because
that
I know,
I'll let you know if you need it, email me and I will just send it all the info that I just read off to
well,
you.
that's what I was gonna say. If you have that summarized for folks, if not, we can do it on our end. I know Addie's taking notes. We could put it in just as minutes for folks, just as a resource. So yeah, I'll follow up with you to get just kind of a summary of that so that people can reference that in the minutes as well.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks so much. Like I said, we do love a follow-up, so thank you for making that happen. All right, y'all, we are right on time to close. I still have not seen any requests for public comment. I would like to, Stephanie, if there's anything from your end before we wrap, because we will not see folks until January. As you know, we canceled the December meeting in lieu of the interim report. I hate to be the person that's like, see you next year, but see you next year is the sentiment here. So Stephanie, any closeouts before we head off into November and December?
Yeah, I just really want to thank everybody. Really, I'm smarter because of all of you. I really enjoy these conversations. When we wrote this brief, gosh, I think going on 3 or 4 years ago, that detailed some of the outstanding issues with mandated reporting, right? You operate in a really lonely place when you sit there and you look at paper and you try to write conclusions. But when I'm with this group, honestly, I feel a great deal of hope and opportunity. And I really mean that. And I want to thank you because you guys always come ready to play, ready to stay. And just thank you. I am heartened. I'm overwhelmed, but I am heartened working with all of you. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate that. All right, y'all. I have to back that up too. This is actually my favorite group. No offense to all my other groups, but you all show up ready to work, and it's really meaningful and enjoyable to work with you. So happy holidays to everybody. We'll see you back in January, and we will certainly be in touch between now and then with a variety of opportunities for input to the interim report. So thank you for all the work you're doing, and take care. We'll see you soon.